This is exciting. The first episode.
Super exciting. I'm ready. I'm ready to rise. Ready to rise with the sisterhood.
Yes, we are rising. It's our time. Our means the sisterhood. It is our time to rise. And I think the question is, why? Why do we need to rise? What's happening in the world right now?
Yeah, almost what isn't happening, because change is happening so quickly. I keep thinking about a river, a rushing river, and I can't help but be swept up by it and move down the river. I can't fight the current. So the question is, how do I swim with it in a way that moves me in the direction I want to go? There are some things in my life, big picture, culturally, that I cannot change. Within my own body, within my own family, change is happening that I cannot stop. So I either resist it, and that's exhausting because I think about standing in that river and just pushing against the current, trying to keep my feet planted. It's eventually not going to work anymore. But in the meantime, it's going to be exhausting. Or I can say, okay, here are the things I can't change. What can I control within that flow that will help me still live the kind of life that God is calling me to?
Yeah. So it's this idea of change is inevitable. Change is happening on both a macro level and a micro level. So it's happening out there in the world, macro, and it's happening micro. It's happening in my world. Change is happening both in my physical environment and, even for me personally, kids leaving the house, going to college, my role changing, right? Like that's very personal. And then also it's happening as I age and as things change, even physically. So there's like all of these different ways of changing. And can I just say, I feel really excited about the changes internally that are happening in me. And that is a change too. And that's a change in a really positive direction these are the things I have control over. I have control over my spiritual growth. I have control over my mindset, how I choose to think about things, right? All of these things. So there's change happening everywhere, some that's hard and some that I feel really good about, but change is change and we have to deal with it.
Okay, so let's talk about it. And we know from listening to you, the listeners, that this is true of your lives as well, that you are trying to figure out, how do I continue to live in this world that seems to be changing so quickly? I don't know what side is up on some things. Like, is this really happening? Am I really reading this headline or this quote? Is this person really saying this? And then also just at home and in all the ways that we are being impacted, you're being impacted too. So that was part of the move, because together we want to rise to meet the challenge of the change. We don't want to just stand and dig our heels in and resist. That doesn't mean we're not standing on what's true. We do want to maintain truth in our lives. But let's do it in a way that's rising to the moment, to meet the moment the way the moment is presenting itself, and in a way that makes a difference. And so there are going to be more effective approaches and less effective approaches. So let's do it in a way, and that's what we're going to be talking about, is what's an effective way to meet the change so that we can continue to be world changers for good right where we are. And so that means not losing the truth of who God says he is and who he says we are. We're still holding on to that. Okay, what does it mean for you, Krista, to move through change as you think about that concept?
Well, it starts with how I'm thinking about change. I really feel like this is the source, is the mindset. And I think when I think about it, and this is something I always encourage other people toward as a coach, but I encourage myself. I mean, when I say I coach myself every day, that is what I do. Like, it's reality. I have to coach myself every day. Mindset is not an outcome. It's not something you just all of a sudden have. It's actually a journey and a process that you have to keep practicing every single day. So one of the things that helps me and that I help my clients with is that life moves forward. It doesn't move backwards. So the more we can position our mind toward forward motion, that we can appreciate or even grieve what's happened in the past, but that the chapter is turning, and for us to say next chapter and to allow the next chapter to come, because the present is really all we have, right? The future is a speculation. It's something that we think may happen, but we don't know. The
True.
past is behind us. It's at this point a dream. It's no longer, it is behind us. So the present is really what we have and what is within our control at the moment. So there's a book that's changing my life, and I'm not kidding. It's called Interior Freedom by Jacques Philippe, and he is a Catholic priest. And the things that he says are so profound that I have to go through this, a tiny book, and I have to go through it so slowly because it's so meaningful. And let me just read to you what he says about the present. Okay. He says, the present moment is rich in grace and holds immense reassurance. This is where God is present. I am with you always to the close of the age. God is the eternal present. Every moment, whatever it brings, is filled with God's presence, rich with the possibility of communion with God. We do not commune with God in the past or the future, but by welcoming each instant as the place where he gives himself to us. And that to me is key, right? It's in the present that he's giving himself to us, not behind us or even ahead of us. We should learn to live in each moment as sufficient to itself, for God is there. And if God is there, we lack nothing. It says there's something that one more part. There is something very liberating in this understanding of the grace of the present moment. Even if the whole of our past has been a disaster, even if our future seems like a dead end, now we can establish communion with God through an act of faith, trust, and abandonment. God is eternally present, eternally young, eternally new, and our past and future are his. He can forgive everything, purify everything, renew everything. It's so filled with hope. So, God is with us today, and he's in the business of taking all that has been your past, all that has shaped you, all of your experiences, all of your abilities, and he is ready to work with you today, in the now, in the present. And change that's happening is a part of that. And he wants to meet us in that change. He wants to meet us in that present, right? He treats us all so individually, and I'll never get over it. I say that all the time because it's true. I'll never get over how personal God is, that he takes the whole of us and he chooses to meet us right in that space very intimately and provide for us very intimately and uniquely. He'll provide for me in a way that I need. And then he gives you something because it's for you. And so as we look at this idea of change, how can we really embrace the present, embrace God and his power and sufficiency and renewal in the present? And how do we make choices going forward? And that to me is so hopeful, that we have the ability to make decisions that move us forward, because again, life is in forward motion. It's not in rewind. And so, okay, the other thing we haven't really talked about, and that is that we're not guaranteed other days. This could be our last year. This could be our last week. This could be our last day. We don't know. We're not guaranteed anything. And so what are we doing? Do we want to let change overwhelm us and take us down and really pin us down in this place of kind of despair and discouragement? Or do we want to say, how do I live as if this may be my last year to live?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we want to do that? Do you ever think about that?
Mm-hmm. It gives perspective, right? That you can kind of quickly let go of some things that you realize, oh, maybe I should let go of those. If you realize that time is short. And I've written about this before, that when my mother-in-law was diagnosed with cancer, it was a long time ago, 18 years ago or something, but she was not given a good prognosis. She was given about 2 years. And
She was stage 4.
she was stage 4 ovarian cancer. Yeah. I mean, she's had a miraculous healing, but we didn't know that at the time. So
Right.
we thought, okay, we believed for a miracle, but me being the realist, I was preparing myself for this. This may be our last time with her, and the time may diminish in quality if she's getting sicker and sicker. All of a sudden, a lot of things did not matter anymore that maybe annoyed me because I chose to let them annoy me. Like, I'm putting this back on me here. I was making choice after choice to let things bother me, that all of a sudden I had this new different perspective, and it's helped our relationship the last 18 years because I just had a mind shift of, I'm going to not let those things bother me. So we could do that for ourselves too. And here's the reality: the longer we live, the more that tends to feel a little more true, because we know people that are our age that are no longer here. And we also are coming to terms with our own aging. And as we watch our parents age, for many of our friends, they've lost their parents. And so the reality of mortality is right here in our faces. And so I get why people have midlife crises, right? Like the reality is here because the change is happening so fast and we don't know how to respond to it. And so I'm kind of in the mode right now of, okay, maybe I am having a midlife crisis, but it's not really a crisis. I'm having a midlife moment.
Evaluation.
That's right. Of recognizing that the life I had built, I hadn't really looked at the continuation of life and change, right? Like, things were changing towards the direction of what I had been planning for. And now they're continuing to change, and in some directions that I'm like, I wasn't really thinking about this. Like, of course, of course, parents are going to age. Of course, kids are going to grow up and move out of the house. But I just hadn't really been focused on that. And of course, I'm going to look older and my husband's going to look older. I mean, of course. And yet, here I am faced with the reality. And so I want to approach this next season of life, the current season, not just the future, but the right now season, with the excitement and hope that God is here and available to me in new ways that I haven't needed him before. And also, you mentioned that internal change, that I am changing, my husband is changing, my children are changing, my parents are changing, like all the things are changing, that doesn't have to be bad, that it can be in a good direction. And Derek and I keep saying, it's just time to mix things up because they're changing anyway. So let's make some changes proactively that are helping us go down that river, that flow, with the stroke that we want, rather than trying to swim against the current.
Yeah. It's so real. And I think that this, you talking about having a midlife moment, what if we shifted from feeling bad, and I'm talking about in general, right? Like, I'm not talking about you, but
You can talk about me.
shifted from being sad that we're in this midlife moment to, wow, what are the new opportunities I can embrace?
Yeah.
What is the new way I can live that communicates hope and strength and courage? It's the narrowing margin. where is the margin narrowing, and what innovation is that creating in my life?
Mhm.
So, as an example for me, I have a lot more time than I've had in like seriously, maybe ever, because
Right.
truly, because
Yeah.
even as I think back to like growing up in school and all the activities I was in, right, that determined my time. And then college determined your time. And I was playing soccer, and then, and then we went and I was teaching, and, I mean, there's always something that's determined my time. And now, like the work that I'm doing, I feel like I get to choose the work that I'm doing. And I know that's a luxury, but I get to choose that. I'm so passionate about coaching, and I get to choose, this podcast and our rebrand, and, and I think that's let's talk about that for a second.
Mhm.
That phrase, I get to choose,
Mhm.
because I get there are some things in life that we don't get to choose.
Yes.
Right. And
Yep.
I want to talk about that in a second. I have a really great quote about that. But ultimately, we get to choose pretty much in every situation how we are going to deal with that. Like I get to choose whether I stay in this job or I find another job.
Mhm.
I get to choose whether I approach my husband with grace or I'm critical at every turn. I get to choose whether I invest in myself internally or I keep fighting this outward decay that's happening, right? Like
Mhm.
I get to choose. There's something
Mhm.
about that statement that is so powerful. How
Mhm.
have you found that to be true?
Yeah. It's based in theology that God gives us agency to
Yeah.
choose him or not. That's the ultimate, right? Like the ultimate choice he gives us. He offers his love and grace. We can choose to receive it or not. But that trickles down into the very practical of choice. And we've talked in the last year about how I've been working out a lot more. I did this morning. It was a choice. I didn't really want to. Like I wasn't 100% yay when I went and put on my clothes and picked up the weights. And yet, as I was doing it, it was this physical reminder to me that I get to choose in so many
Mhm.
areas of my life. I get to this isn't necessarily comfortable, it's not necessarily easy, but in the end I will be grateful that I did it.
Mhm.
And that habit of doing that physically changes my mindset for other things that I get to do throughout the day, get to do. And I need to have that mindset because so many of the current challenges that are new that I am facing that are a result of change, I can see them as a gift that I get to deal with this.
Mhm.
Or the alternative is that that issue is not there at all. And when I look at it that way, often I recognize I would rather deal with the challenge that's being presented to me than the absence of the challenge, because that might mean the absence of a person, the
Mm.
absence of
Okay, I wondered where you
finances.
were going with that. Oh, I see what you're saying.
Like if I'm in conflict with someone, what's the alternative? That person isn't in my life anymore.
Okay.
I would rather be dealing with the conflict with the potential of things getting better than no relationship at all.
Mhm.
I would rather be dealing with a changing body than be dead. That's the
Mhm.
reality. I would
Mhm.
rather be dealing with something in my marriage than no marriage at all, because it is a gift. It is a gift. It's
Mhm.
not always easy, but it is a gift. And so considering what the alternative might be sometimes helps me as well in dealing with the change.
It's good. I want to talk about this idea of what happens when there's something in our lives where we can't change,
Mhm.
and maybe something really painful happened in the past and we just are really having a hard time getting over it. And it's again from this book, Interior Freedom. He has introduced a concept to me that has been so helpful, and I just want to share it. And it's this idea that you make the decision to consent to what has happened. So, and it's a very deliberate word. and I think it's an important word, that you consent to the reality of what it is, in that you allow it in your spirit. And it gets back to that word you were saying in the beginning, resisting. We stop resisting and we just consent to it. And it is in that place that God can heal us. It's so powerful. And you'll have to dive into it if you would like to read more about it. But I just want to read a little bit of what he says about that concept. There is a consenting to what we did not originally choose. There is a paradoxical law of human life here. One cannot become truly free unless one accepts not always being free. The fact is that situations that really make us grow are precisely those we don't control. So those I just read, a few different quotes from that section. But this whole idea that actually the things that happen to us that are hard often produce the greatest growth. So how do we embrace that growth? How do we consent to what happened? Doesn't mean we have to say we like it. Doesn't mean to say we're glad it happened, but we literally consent to it, knowing that God's grace meets us in the present. And that is the path to interior freedom, that we understand that God can take all things in our lives, like we were talking about before, that whole package, and he will meet us right there. And he will help us to move forward from there. So it helps us to stop living in that past pain over and over and over and over again.
I'm worried people are going to be caught up by the word consent, given today's use of it often has to do with sexual assault. So just the idea of abuse, if something so terrible happened to you, it's the concept, another word I heard you read is the concept of accepting that it happened and not fighting that it is part of your story. That doesn't mean that it was okay or that God intended that to happen, that terrible thing.
No.
It's that you can fight the reality of how that's impacting you, or you can accept this was a very painful, soul-altering experience. And God, you can meet me in that pain and that grief and those holes and those bruises. You are there to heal me and maybe use those scars in a way for something redemptive. That doesn't mean God intended for that to happen.
Right.
However, he can meet you there for sure. Is that what
how
you're reading it?
Yeah, the whole idea is that we become free in our interior. And in order to become free in the internal place, we actually do have to accept the good and the bad that has happened in our life. And we have to recognize that no matter what happens, even going forward, that we're in a safe space with God in our interior way. And there's a lot of examples in this book because it's called Interior Freedom, but Auschwitz survivors. And, he uses this example of this group of the prisoners who actually did not survive. And they literally went into their executions singing songs of praise to God. Well, what is that in a person that allows them to go through such horrific things, but still allows them to go to their execution singing hymns of praise to God? There's something in that interior place that the Germans couldn't touch, right? And even they could attack their bodies, they could hurt their bodies, but they couldn't touch that spirit on the inside. And I think that's what we're going for, right? Is that in the midst of all these changes, in the midst of all of this stuff, that you can't touch my spirit. My spirit is intact because I know I have a God who loves me. I have a God who meets me, and I have a God who's giving me hope in the future. And there is just something so profound about that kind of freedom.
Yeah, I would say, especially if it's a hurt that somebody else has put on you, that to say that. It reminds me of my friend and mentor, Heather Cotillo, who just passed away from cancer. She remembered as soon as she was diagnosed in it, and she did not have a good prognosis. She was a nurse and her husband's a physician, so they knew this isn't good. She remembered a woman that she had known years earlier when they worked in Washington, D.C., who also had been diagnosed with cancer. And that woman's response was not, God, why me? But more, why not me? And Heather wanted to adopt that attitude. She just remembered right away, like she had always admired that woman's response to her diagnosis. And I said, okay, tell me more about that. And she said, I, as a nurse, have treated people with terrible illness, and I've lived a very healthy life. And this isn't God's punishment on me, but it is part of living in this broken world, is that disease exists and pain exists. And so we shouldn't be surprised when pain comes in our direction. Almost we should expect it. And so with something like a diagnosis, we shouldn't be surprised when disease hits our body. We should expect it because that's part of living in the temporal broken world. And that was such a different mindset than I had heard before. And so I think it kind of parallels that, like, to not be surprised when change happens, that it happens, because that is living in this world. And when it happens in a direction that we don't like, to almost have this, oh, maybe I should have expected this, because God does promise us that life will be hard. That is one thing he does say. And then he also promises us that he will be with us.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what happens if we don't. If we don't, how do we want to say that? If we don't move with the change, then what happens?
Well, I can say for me, I get resentful. I resent my circumstances, or I resent other people that are changing and I don't want them to, or are not changing and I want them to. And it's exhausting. It's fighting that current. Or so we get resentful, or I think they can happen at the same time or independently. We get stuck and we are resisting change and we don't grow. And I think then when we get stuck, that can breed resentment.
Yeah, I think too, we miss the goodness of God. I mean, I think of Psalm 27:15 that says, "Yet I am confident I will see the Lord's goodness while I am here in the land of the living." And I think when we don't pivot forward, when we don't make those adjustments, and we're constantly looking back to what was, then we miss the goodness of God that is right here in the present land of the living, right? That is like all around us. That's why, I mean, I know people are tired of hearing like gratitude, 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 but there's a reason, because it literally changes our brains. And we will miss God's goodness if we don't call out what we are thankful for and what we notice, the good things we notice in the moment. It's that idea of hunting for good, which actually from a military. The Army created this incredible program, and one of their tenets is hunt for the good. And there is so much brain research behind it. But if you're hunting for the good, you are what we as Christians call seeing God in the land of the living. That's what we're seeing around us. And it's so good for our souls, for our brains, everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I wrote a little book about it. If you want to, if you want to figure out the practical of how in that. Okay. Well, what are the 3 questions? Getting to practical. Someone is facing a change. And what are 3 questions that they can ask themselves when looking at what's right in front of them?
Yeah, I think the first one is that assessment piece. And sometimes we don't do that. Like we're a little bit bothered. We feel a little off. And we're like, I don't even know why. Like, I don't really know why I'm unsettled. Like you'll wake up in the middle of the night and you'll be like, why am I thinking about this? Like, why is this so unsettling? So I think it's just assessment, what is happening? And maybe the question, if it's a change, is what is the scope of the change? So who's involved? What's going on? When is that happening? Where is that happening? I mean, just really just doing that assessment piece of, okay, this is what it is, kind of like you are here on the map. You are here. Okay, what else can we ask?
I think that's super helpful because, like you said, I think often we skip over it and we just go to the emotions, but then to name things really is helpful. So that's the next thing. I would say do the assessment first and then do the emotions. How do I feel about it? And naming your emotions is helpful. To say, I'm frustrated, I'm scared, I'm excited, I'm
all of the above.
Yeah, I'm enjoying this change. I am resentful of the change. I am surprised. I think that's a lot of it is just I wasn't expecting it. So I'm a little bit disoriented. So that again helps you recognize what you're dealing with. Because if you can deal with the actual circumstances, what is it? What's changing? And then how am I feeling about it? Then I think you can move into, okay, so now what? And
right. So how can I rise?
Right.
Like how can I rise to this change or to this thing, whatever it is? And you know what helps me? It helps me to think of someone who's done that well, or to think of a time I've done it well. And how can I access that same experience that I had in that situation and apply it to this situation? Or like, how can I use that person who I saw do a change or something very well and kind of access their strength in that?
And I've asked myself that question a number of times the last few weeks. How can I rise to meet this challenge, whatever it is? And it may be something really small. Like that question can feel really big, but it could be just a challenge of the day. Like, okay, the one hard thing I'm really not looking forward to today is this. How can I rise to meet it? It gives me confidence that God has allowed me to be in this space and to say, if he thinks I can, I'm here and it's here in front of me, he's going to give me the tools I need. And then, you can practically think through what those are, but just knowing that God has allowed me to be in these circumstances, that means it is my moment to rise. And if he believes in me, then I can do it.
Yeah. And that we were born for this generation in this moment. We talked about that too, a little bit in our name change episode, but there's a reality to that. And I love looking at stories too. Both Alex and I love Strength to Strength. I know you listeners have heard probably too much about this book, but we love it so much. And the book starts out with the story of Darwin and J.S. Bach. And it contrasts their lives. And Arthur Brooks, he talks about how Darwin, had his magnum opus, so to speak, at age 50. And then from that place really like crashed and burned and died a very miserable man. And J.S. Bach, who actually was in his time, even though he's probably the most famous composer of the Bachs, in that time, he actually was surpassed in popularity by his son. And he decided, I'm going to dedicate my life to educating my son and other composers. And he kept working on his own stuff too. And that was eventually rediscovered. And again, like he's been the one over time that has really risen to the top. But in his time, he was kind of a has-been. And so he had a choice. What am I going to do about that? And he decides to make this change to invest in others. And it turns out to give him so much life. And he died a very happy man. So here's Darwin and here's, JS, and they're kind of going about this whole thing so differently and going about the change in their lives so differently. And it's a very inspiring story because I don't want to be Darwin.
Mm-hmm. There's a quote right there. I don't want to be Darwin. Yeah, it's the current. Like one goes with the current and one is resisting. And it's exhausting to resist it. Mm-hmm. I think in my own life in the last few years, you mentioned, kids leaving the house. It's a big pivotal time for a family where up until now, you've probably been adding kids until somebody is gone. And, we're talking about kids leaving for college. They're not gone, but things are changing. And I had heard from enough women that it was really helpful during that phase of maybe loss of what has been to be looking forward to something new, so that you kind of have that balance of these two things can be true at once. I can be losing my family operating in the way that it has for the last several years, and I'm grieving that. I mean, and let's name that. I'm feeling it. This is what is. And then my feeling is that I have grief around it. And then how can I rise? And that was when a couple of years ago, I took a part-time job. And it was a way for me to say, I still have things that maybe I haven't tapped into, that this change is allowing me. You mentioned time, but also allowing me to build new skills. And I can invest in other ways to advocate for kids that aren't my own kids in my home, but I'm working on behalf of children. And so this idea that I am going to intentionally step into something new. I'm going to go with the current and I'm going to step into a new space while I'm stepping out of an old space actually made it, I think, so much easier. I was still grieving, but I was also excited about something. And so it wasn't my grief wasn't the only thing I was focused on. I'll say that. So it allowed for this more rich experience of life as I moved into change.
Yeah. And actually that is backed by neuroscience. What you're saying, that's actually like a thing people study, is having things to look forward to. And so that's a good question. What can we build into our life that gives us excitement and that gives us something to look forward to? And maybe that is learning a new skill, or maybe it is a job change. Maybe you've been at your job for a long time and it's time to, pivot into something else or grow in a different way. But, really allowing yourself the freedom to plan things to look forward to or make those changes. Okay, let's end today on how does your faith impact your understanding of this forward movement that we're talking about?
Well, for me, I remind myself that I cannot derail God's plans. So as change is happening around me, my response and the change itself is not going to change God's big picture in the world. He's still going to return and redeem all things. I can still be working on his kingdom come today. And so when change is happening, a question I can ask myself is, where is God moving? Where am I seeing redemption in the world? Because that's his spirit moving. And how can I join in what he's already doing? So if there is a good movement of I don't know, name something where you see good things happening. God's goodness is in there somewhere.
Mhm.
And then I can join him in that process and say, where do I fit? Where do I fit in how I sense your spirit is already moving?
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think it's as simple as this idea of like, we're people of hope. And, we've said it before, we'll keep saying it. We are hope bearers. And so it informs everything about how we get to choose, how we lean in to challenges, opportunities. I mean, sometimes it's a change, sometimes it's just an opportunity, and we need to have the courage to walk through it. But having hope that there is a hope in a future, for each one of us and for our world, and to be people who hold that light in the dark. I mean, if we're not holding light, then who is? And so let's hold that light out and let's be that light in the world.
Amen.
Okay, with that, everyone, go out into your life today, into your change, into whatever's happening, with hope and with light. And we'll see you next week.
Okay, bye.
Bye.